Imagine being told you'll never make it, that you don't belong. But what if I told you that the greatest triumphs come from the hardest battles? Don't miss out on the full story. Hit subscribe now and see how one man defied the odds and they became a hero. Stay tuned. The journey's just beginning. Jalen Thompson had always been different, not in the way that people expect when they say different. No, he wasn't the quirky kid who wore mismatched socks or the introvert who preferred books over sports. Jalen was different because of the color of his skin. It was something he never had to be reminded of, but it was something that seemed to define him for everyone around him. In his small town, in a community that was slow to accept change, Jalen often found himself standing alone. A black teenager in a predominantly white town, Jalen wasn't just marked by his race, he was judged by it too. His dream was simple. He wanted to be a soldier. For as long as he could remember, the military had intrigued him. It wasn't just the uniform or the idea of being part of something bigger. It was the discipline, the strength, the honor that came with serving. But in a place where people saw his ambition as foolish, Jalen quickly learned that his dream would not come easily. From the moment Jalen began expressing his desire to join the military, the mockery started. It began subtly at first, comments that weren't overtly cruel but still left a sting. "You want to be a soldier?" One of his classmates sneered in the hallway, the mockery dripping from every word. "Maybe try something that actually fits. Maybe football. You know, something that makes sense." Jalen tried to laugh it off, but the words sat with him longer than they should have. They cut deeper than he let on. The whispers followed to him into the classroom, the locker room, even during lunch. The ridicule came in waves, from classmates who looked at him like he was delusional. "You, a soldier," they would say, eyes filled with disbelief. "The army won't even look at someone like you. It's not meant for people like us." And it wasn't just the kids in his class. Jalen's teachers, the supposed role models, in his life subtly reinforced the message. They'd dismiss his aspirations with a passing comment or change the subject entirely when his dream was mentioned. "Dreams are nice, Jalen," one teacher said once, patting him on the shoulder, "but you need a real plan. Have you thought about college? Maybe something practical." The worst of it came from his friends. They were supposed to be the ones who understood, the ones who lifted him up, but even they had their doubts. In the beginning, they laughed along with him, pretending to support his ambition. But as time passed, their words became more biting. "You're not going to make it, man. You think they'll let someone like you in?" they said. It stung not just because of the message they conveyed, but because deep down Jalen began to question if they were right. His dreams seemed to crumble with each passing day. It wasn't just the words that hurt, it was the looks, the sighs, the constant insinuation that someone like him didn't belong in the military. Jalen's heart sank every time he saw another military poster on a wall at school, knowing that the person they were depicting would never look like him. His desire to serve seemed impossible, an unreachable goal. The thought of wearing the uniform, of standing with pride in the military, seemed to get farther and farther away with each mocking glance. But what hurt the most, what truly dug deep into his soul, was how it felt to be betrayed by his own family. His mother, the one person who should have supported him no matter what, looked at his dream with skepticism. She worried for him. "You don't know what it's like out there, Jalen," she would say in a soft but firm tone. "The world is cruel to people who look like you. You'll just be another number, another statistic." His mother wasn't wrong. That I'd seen the way the world treated people who looked like him. It was something Jalen had experienced firsthand, the subtle and not so subtle discrimination. But it was also the way his mother said it that hurt him the most. It wasn't a message of love and concern. It was a resignation, a belief that the system was bigger than him, that he would never be able to break through it. She was afraid of what the world would do to him. She didn't want to lose him, and perhaps, more than anything, she didn't want to watch him fail. But Jalen couldn't be afraid of failure. He couldn't. The idea of giving up on his dream, the only dream that made him feel truly alive, was worse than any mockery, any criticism, or any doubt. If he let go of his dream now, what would he have left? So, instead of listening to the voices that told him he couldn't, Jalen began to dream in secret. When no one was around to see, he would close his eyes and picture himself in uniform, standing tall with the pride of a soldier. He imagined himself in combat, leading his squad with honor and strength. In these moments he felt unstoppable. The whispers of his peers and the doubts of his family faded into the background, drowned out by the clarity of his vision. But reality was harder to escape. Every time he walked out into the world, Jalen felt the weight of the judgment. He passed by the boys who laughed at him in the hallway and the people who silently shook their heads when they saw him with his military pamphlets. It wasn't just the physical mockery, it was the emotional toll of constantly feeling like he didn't belong. One afternoon, as Jalen was walking home from school, a group of his classmates saw him and started to taunt him, making exaggerated gestures of mockery. "Hey Jalen, when's your next military exercise? You ready for boot camp, soldier?" They laughed and pushed each other, as if it were all a joke. Jalen stopped in his tracks, feeling the blood rush to his face. He had grown used to the mocking, but this time it felt different. This time it felt like they had won. As he stood there, surrounded by the mocking laughter, something inside him shifted. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was resolve. Jalen realized that he wasn't going to let their words control him. He wasn't going to let their doubt determine his fate. That night, lying in bed with the weight of the world pressing down on him, Jalen made a promise to himself. He would no longer hide his dreams or allow the opinions of others to steer him off course. He was going to fight for his future, no matter what it took. No matter how many times they told him he couldn't do it, he would prove them wrong. Jalen would join the military, and he would become a soldier. Jalen's heart raced as he stood in front of the military recruiter's office. The walls around him seemed to close in, but he stood tall, his resolve harder than it had ever been. This was the moment that would define the rest of his life. Everything he had endured, all the mockery, the doubt, the judgment, this was the time to prove them wrong. The moment his feet crossed that threshold, he knew there was no turning back. His hand shook slightly as he reached for the door, the weight of what he was about to do pressing heavily on his chest. Every part of him screamed for him to turn around, to go back to the comfort of what was familiar, the safety of people who thought they knew what was best for him. But in the midst of his doubt, a memory flashed before him: his mother's worried face, the disbelief in his friends' eyes, the laughter of those who thought his dream was nothing more than a joke. He could hear their voices now, as clearly as he had years ago. "You're too weak," his old classmates would say. "You'll never make it. The military isn't for you. They won't let someone like you in." Those words had haunted him for so long, like a shadow that refused to go away, but now they seemed to fade into the background. This time, it was different. This time Jalen knew who he was, and he knew exactly what he was capable of. When the recruiter finally welcomed him into the office, the atmosphere felt almost surreal. The polished desk, the pamphlets filled with bold words like strength and honor, the uniforms hanging on the walls, it was all so much larger than the world he had known, a world where people like him were told to play small. But none of that fazed him. He wasn't here for the glamour. He was here to change the trajectory of his life, to prove that he was more than the sum of everyone's doubts. "Are you sure about this?" the recruiter asked, his voice not unkind, but measured. "Joining the military is a big commitment. It's not for everyone." Jalen's response came quickly, the words falling from his lips with a confidence he hadn't known he possessed. "I'm sure," he said, his voice steady. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. I belong here." The recruiter studied him for a moment, his eyes scanning the young man in front of him, perhaps weighing the sincerity in Jalen's words, or the fire that burned behind his eyes. Finally he nodded. "All right, Jalen, let's get started." The signing of the papers, the physical tests, the psychological evaluations, it all felt like a blur. It was like every obstacle he had ever faced in life led him to this moment. And with each hurdle he cleared, he felt stronger. He was proving something to himself, not just to everyone who had doubted him. He had found a space where his ambition could breathe, where the judgments of his past didn't matter. But still, even as he stood in the recruiter's office, something tugged at him, a whisper of doubt. Would he really make it? Would the military see him as capable? Or would they view him as just another dreamer who didn't belong? He thought of his friends, of the ones who had laughed at him. Could he really make it in a world where people like him were so often overlooked, so often underestimated? That night, as Jalen lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the doubts crept back in, the old fears rising like the tide. What if he wasn't strong enough? What if the stories he had heard about prejudice in the military were true? What if the very institution he dreamed of serving in would reject him? He closed his eyes, trying to push the questions away, but they lingered like shadows in the corners of his mind. His hand found its way to the military pamphlet on his nightstand. He opened it, and the words jumped out at him, bold and unwavering. Your duty, your honor, your legacy. The words didn't just speak to him, they challenged him. They challenged him to prove that he wasn't just a byproduct of his environment, that his dreams were worthy of pursuit, no matter how impossible they seemed. As the days passed, Jalen felt the weight of that decision become more and more real. The uniform, the training, the life of a soldier, they weren't just dreams anymore. They were his future, and no matter how hard it would be, he was going to fight for it. Every step forward was one more step away from the mockery of his past, one more step toward the future he had always envisioned. He stood in front of his mirror one evening, the army brochures spread across his dresser. He saw himself in the reflection not as the boy who had been mocked, but as the man he was becoming. His jaw set, his posture straightened, and for the first time he didn't see the boy who was told he didn't belong. He saw a soldier. The day he left for boot camp was the hardest yet. Saying goodbye to his mother, who still feared for him, was harder than any physical challenge he would face. He could see the worry in her eyes, the same worry that had plagued her for years. "Be careful, Jalen," she whispered. "I don't want to lose you." "I'll be okay, Mom," he assured her, hugging her tightly. "I promise you, I'm not giving up." But as he walked away, leaving the familiar streets of his hometown behind, Jalen felt a fire ignite in his chest. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving to himself that no matter what he had been through, no matter how many times he had been knocked down, he could rise. He wasn't the sum of other people's doubts. He was the architect of his own future. Boot camp was everything he had imagined and more. Every day was a battle, a test of both mind and body. The rigorous training was grueling. There were moments where Jalen wanted to give up, where the fatigue and doubt threatened to overwhelm him. But every time he thought about quitting, he thought about the kids back home who had laughed at him, his mom's worried face, and the life he had left behind. It kept him going. He didn't just survive boot camp, he thrived. And every time he completed a task, every time he earned a new stripe on his uniform, Jalen felt stronger, more capable. He realized that the strength he was cultivating wasn't just physical, it was mental and emotional. He was becoming the man he always knew he could be. When it came time to graduate from boot camp, Jalen stood tall with the rest of his platoon, his chest swelling with pride. He had proven to himself that no matter the obstacle, no matter the doubt, he could rise. He had taken the first step toward becoming the man he was always meant to be, a soldier, and this was just the beginning. Jalen had never imagined that the true test of his resolve would come so quickly. The initial days of training at boot camp were grueling, but he felt strong, driven by the fire that had carried him here. Every push-up, every run, every obstacle course was a step toward proving himself, not just to others, but to the young man he saw in the mirror. The laughter of his classmates, the disbelieving expressions from his family, they were all fading away in the rearview mirror, each day spent in boot camp bringing him closer to his goal. Yet, as challenging as it all was, it didn't compare to what was ahead. The day of his first mission came faster than he expected. It wasn't just another training, exercise, or simulated combat. This was the real deal. The stakes were high. The military was sending him and his unit to a region where the tension was thick, where the sound of gunfire and the threat of violence were as constant as the air they breathed. There was no safety net now, no controlled environment. This was the moment Jalen had trained for, but even with all his preparation, he could feel the nerves creeping in. As Jalen stood with his fellow soldiers in the staging area, he couldn't help but notice the look on their faces. Different than any of the camaraderie they'd shared back in camp, the weight of the unknown hung over them like a cloud. They were about to go into the heart of enemy territory, and no one knew exactly what to expect. The tension was palpable, and even the most hardened soldiers seemed to feel it. His commanding officer gave the briefing, laying out the mission in clear, concise terms. It was a covert operation. Intelligence had suggested a high-ranking target in the area, someone responsible for much of the chaos in the region. The mission was risky, but the orders were clear. Jalen could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him as his team moved into position. He wasn't just fighting for his country, now he was fighting for himself, for the man he had promised to become. As they moved into enemy territory, Jalen's mind was sharp, his senses heightened. He was aware of every rustle in the trees, every shift in the wind. His training had prepared him for this moment, but nothing could prepare him for what was about to happen. The ambush came without warning. The first gunshots rang out, and chaos erupted. The enemy, hidden in the shadows, had anticipated their every move. Jalen's heart raced as his body reacted on instinct. He ducked for cover, his mind instantly calculating the best course of action. In a split second, his training kicked in, and he returned fire, providing cover for his team. The world around him seemed to explode in a cacophony of sound: gunfire, explosions, shouts, and the pounding of his own heart. The fear he had felt earlier was gone now. This wasn't about the doubters anymore. This wasn't about the people who told him he didn't belong here. This was about survival. It was about protecting the men and women beside him. It was about showing the world and proving to himself that he had what it took. As the firefight raged on, Jalen found himself in the thick of it, moving from cover to cover, staying low, keeping his head down. The only thing that mattered now was the mission and the team. His hands were steady, his breath calm despite the chaos that surrounded him. In the distance, he could hear the shouts of his fellow soldiers, ordering each other into position, coordinating their movements, ensuring that the group was safe. Jalen, despite being the newest member, was already part of the rhythm, part of the pulse of the operation. It was then that disaster struck. An enemy sniper, hidden on a rooftop far across the street, fired a shot that hit one of Jalen's fellow soldiers. The man fell to the ground, his body going limp, and the cries of his comrades filled the air. In an instant, everything froze. For Jalen, this was the moment that would test him like nothing else had. He couldn't hesitate. He couldn't afford to second-guess himself. His instincts took over. Without thinking, Jalen sprinted across the street, his eyes scanning for any movement, his mind locked on the injured soldier. He dove behind a parked vehicle, drawing fire away from the team, his movements sharp and deliberate. The heat of the moment, the deafening sounds of combat, all faded into the background as Jalen focused solely on getting to his teammate. As he neared the soldier, another shot rang out, narrowly missing him, but Jalen didn't flinch. His focus was laser-sharp, his body moving on automatic. He reached the injured soldier, pulling him into cover just as another round of gunfire echoed through the street. His breath was ragged, his heart pounding, but he didn't stop. He wasn't about to lose someone else on his watch. The pain in his chest, the fear that gripped him, those were things he had no time for. The only thing that mattered was getting his teammate to safety. After what felt like an eternity, Jalen managed to drag the soldier to safety, where the medic was able to stabilize him. The firefight continued around them, but Jalen's focus was unwavering. His mind was sharp. The doubts of his past, the mockery of his classmates, the skepticism of his family, and of that mattered now. What mattered was that he had done what no one expected of him. He had risen to the occasion. He had protected his comrades, and he had done so without hesitation, without fear. The operation was a success, and when they finally returned to base, Jalen felt a sense of pride that he had never known. But more than that, he felt something else. He felt the weight of his journey. That boy who had been mocked, the boy who had been told he didn't belong, had proven himself in the most intense of situations. His actions in the field, his ability to lead under pressure, had earned him the respect of his fellow soldiers. He had not only survived, he had thrived. As they sat around the campfire that night, exhausted but victorious, Jalen's commander approached him, a rare smile on his face. "Good job, Thompson," he said, his voice gruff but approving. "You did well out there. You proved you've got what it takes." Jalen nodded, his heart swelling with pride. He hadn't just survived the test, he had passed it with flying colors. The world had doubted him, had tried to tell him he wasn't enough. But Jalen had shown everyone, most of all, himself, that he was more than capable. This was just the beginning. The journey he had started was far from over, and every battle from here on out would only make him stronger. The sun had barely begun to rise over the military base when Jalen stood in front of his commanding officer, his heart pounding in his chest. It was a moment he had never imagined would come so soon, yet here he was, being called in for an official meeting. His uniform was pressed, his boots polished to perfection. But it wasn't the shine of his gear that made him stand taller today. It was the weight of his actions, the recognition he was about to receive, that filled him with a sense of purpose and pride that could never be captured in a medal or a ribbon. But today, that medal would come. Jalen Thompson, the commanding officer, began, his voice steady, yet filled with a deep respect. "You have proven yourself not just as a soldier, but as a leader. Your actions in the field, your courage, your unwavering determination, these are the qualities of a true hero." Jalen felt his throat tighten as his commander continued, but he didn't dare speak. He had always been a man of few words, preferring to let his actions speak louder than anything he could say. He had lived through countless battles, both physical and emotional, and now, standing here, he felt like all the years of struggle had led to this single moment of validation. The officer reached into a drawer and pulled out a small rectangular box, the kind that could only hold something of great importance. As the lid flipped open, Jalen's eyes caught the gleam of a medal that reflected the light, shining brightly despite the somber atmosphere. "The Silver Star," the officer said. "This is for your bravery under fire, for your quick thinking, your leadership, and for your determination in the face of adversity. You not only risked your life to save a comrade, but you did so with a calm and clarity that saved many others. Today, you have earned the respect of this entire unit." The officer pinned the medal onto Jalen's chest, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Jalen touched the medal, his fingers brushing over its smooth surface, and he could feel the weight of its meaning. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was the culmination of every sleepless night, every moment of doubt, every mocking voice that had told him he would never be good enough. It was the symbol of everything he had fought for. As the ceremony continued, Jalen's mind flashed back to those dark days when he had been the target of ridicule. The days when he had been told he was too weak, too inexperienced, too black, to ever achieve something like this. He had fought against those voices with every ounce of his being, and now, standing here, in front of his fellow soldiers, he realized that those doubts had been the fuel that had driven him. Without them, he might never have found the strength to keep going. But the Silver Star wasn't just for Jalen, it was for every person who had ever been told they couldn't achieve something because of who they were, where they came from, or what they looked like. This was for everyone who had ever been underestimated. This was a victory not just for him, but for the people who believed in him, who had stood by him when the world seemed determined to tear him down. When the ceremony ended, Jalen stood there, his chest swollen with pride. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be more battles, more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But for the first time, he felt ready. He had earned his place in this world, not by fighting against others, but by fighting for his own belief in himself. The days following the recognition were a whirlwind. Jalen's story began to spread within the military. He wasn't just the new guy who had come out of nowhere, he was now a symbol of resilience, a person others looked up to, a hero in their eyes. The respect he had earned from his comrades wasn't given lightly, and Jalen never took it for granted. Each day he pushed himself harder, knowing that his actions in the field would always be the true measure of his worth, not the medals or the praise. Yet, with every passing day, Jalen realized that the recognition was not just about the medal, it was about the impact he had on those around him. His fellow soldiers began to trust him more, not just because of his bravery, but because of the way he led by example. He didn't just give orders, he listened. He didn't just act on impulse. He thought strategically, always keeping the well-being of his unit in mind. His leadership was quiet but effective, grounded in his own experiences. shaped by his desire to protect and uplift those who stood beside him. One afternoon, as Jalen sat in the mess hall with a few of his fellow soldiers, one of them leaned over to him. "Jalen, you know, I used to think I wasn't cut out for this," the soldier said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But after seeing how you handled that mission, after seeing the way you never gave up, I know I can do it too. You've inspired all of us." Jalen looked up at him, his expression softening. This was the moment he had been waiting for, not the praise, not the recognition, but the quiet moments when he could see the ripple effect of his actions. The way his struggles had given someone else the courage to keep going. The way his fight had inspired others to fight for their own dreams. Jalen's story wasn't just about overcoming adversity in battle. It was about overcoming the invisible battles, the doubts, the fears, the voices that told him he wasn't good enough. And every time he took a step forward, every time he proved himself, he was helping others to do the same. And so, as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Jalen continued to rise, not just as a soldier, but as a leader, a mentor, and an inspiration. He had become more than just a man in a uniform. He had become a beacon of hope for anyone who had ever been told they couldn't achieve their dreams. As he stood in front of the mirror one night, looking at the silver star hanging proudly on his chest, Jalen smiled. This was just the beginning. The world had tried to break him, tried to make him believe he didn't belong. But now, with the honor of his service and the respect of his peers, he knew one thing for certain. No one would ever define his worth again. He had earned his place, and this was only the beginning of his legacy. The sound of the military transports. Engines gradually faded as the aircraft made its descent, the familiar landscape of Jalen's hometown slowly coming into view. It had been months since he had last stepped foot here, but as he peered out the window, the small town below seemed unchanged, quiet, still, as though time had stood still. The houses lined up in neat rows, the streets that once seemed so confining, the very ground he had walked upon as a boy, all looked the same. Yet Jalen knew, without a doubt, that he was no longer the same man who had left. As the plane touched down, the thought of returning home was both exhilarating and overwhelming. He wasn't just coming back as the young man who had been mocked and doubted by those around him. He was returning as someone who had earned the respect of his peers, someone who had been tested in the harshest conditions, and had come out on the other side stronger, more resolute. He was a soldier, a leader, and a hero, but still, a small part of him wondered, would the town see him the way he now saw himself, or would they see only the kid who had dared to dream big and failed? The drive from the airport to his hometown was a quiet one, the streets looking as he remembered them familiar but distant. His mother's house, where he had grown up, stood at the edge of town, its front porch just as he had left it. But this time, as he walked up the steps, there was no longer a sense of fear or insecurity. There was only a feeling of peace, knowing that he had walked a path few had believed possible, and had overcome every obstacle in his way. When his mother opened the door, her eyes immediately filled with tears. She took him in her arms, and, for a moment, Jalen simply let himself lean into her embrace. The warmth of her hug, the smell of her perfume, the comfort of her presence, it was all so familiar, so grounding. Yet even in this moment of closeness, Jalen couldn't help but feel the distance that had grown between them during the time he had spent away. It wasn't just the miles that had separated them. It was the transformation he had undergone. "You're home," she whispered, pulling back to look at him, her hands gently brushing away the tears that had escaped her eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Jalen. I knew you were strong, but I never imagined you'd come back as this." Jalen smiled, a little self-consciously, as he nodded toward his uniform. "It's a part of me now, Mom, but I'm still your son. Nothing's changed about that." But the truth was, everything had changed. He was no longer the boy who had been afraid to follow his dreams, afraid to push through the barriers that others had placed in his way. He had proven himself not just to the world, but to the one person whose opinion had mattered most, himself. As they sat down together at the kitchen table, Jalen's mother poured them both a cup of tea, and the conversation turned to his time in the military. Jalen recounted the missions, the friends he had made, and the places he had been, but he was careful not to glorify the pain and the difficulty of it all. He spoke of the sacrifices, the close calls, the moments when fear had threatened to take over, but he also spoke of the triumph, the times when his team had come together, when his leadership had made a difference, when he had stepped into danger and come out stronger for it. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice softer now. "Scared, every single time. But I didn't let it stop me. I couldn't." His mother listened, her gaze never leaving his face. For the first time in a long while, Jalen felt the walls between them fall away. The doubt, the fear, the protective instinct that had always kept her on edge, they had faded in the face of his story. She could see the man he had become, the one who had endured and fought and triumphed. He wasn't the same boy who had left all those months ago, and she was proud of him not just for what he had achieved, but for who he had become in the process. Later that day, word spread around town that Jalen was home. It wasn't long before old friends, neighbors, and familiar faces began showing up at his doorstep. Some came with smiles and congratulations, while others simply stood in awe of the man he had become. Jalen noticed the shift in their eyes, the respect, the admiration, the recognition that he had earned, not through words, but through actions. He was no longer just a kid with big dreams. He was the embodiment of those dreams realized. But even amidst the praise, Jalen couldn't help but think back to the laughter, the disbelief, and the doubt he had faced growing up. It was all too easy to forget how far he had come, how much he had fought to reach this point. And yet, standing there surrounded by people who once doubted him, he realized that the battle wasn't over. The real test was how he would use his newfound position. How would he inspire others? How could he ensure that his story wasn't just a personal triumph, but a message to those who were still facing the struggles he had once faced? The town's small community center was where the gathering took place. It was a place filled with memories of high school dances, town meetings, and countless community events. But tonight, it was different. Tonight, it was filled with people who had watched Jalen grow, people who had once doubted him, and people who now looked at him with a mixture of pride and awe. As Jalen stepped up to the microphone, his heart was steady, his voice calm. He wasn't nervous, he was ready to tell his story, ready to show them all that the impossible could be achieved. His journey had been long and hard, but it had shaped him into the man he was today. And now, standing in front of them all, Jalen spoke not just of his accomplishments, but of the journey that had brought him here. "You know, I used to wonder if I'd ever make it," he said, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. "I used to think that the people who told me I couldn't do it might be right. But then I realized something, their doubts didn't define me. I did." The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. "Whatever your dream is," Jalen continued, his voice growing stronger, "don't let anyone take it from you. No matter what they say, no matter how hard it gets, keep fighting, because you never know how close you are to the victory you've been waiting for, and that victory is yours. You just have to believe in it." As Jalen finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't just for him, it was for the dreamers, the fighters, the ones who had been told they couldn't. His words weren't just a personal victory. They were a rallying cry for anyone who had ever been held back by fear or doubt. Jalen, that had come full circle. The boy who had been mocked, the man who had fought for his place in the world, was now a symbol of perseverance, resilience, and hope. His journey wasn't just about overcoming obstacles, it was about helping others to do the same. And as he looked around the room, his heart full of pride and gratitude, Jalen knew that this was only the beginning. His story had just begun, and he would continue to fight not just for his dreams, but for the dreams of everyone who needed a little extra strength to keep going. If this story inspired you, remember, every setback is just a setup for a greater comeback. Don't let anyone tell you your dreams are too big. If you want more powerful stories that ignite your spirit, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like and share with those who need a dose of motivation. Keep pushing, keep fighting. Your journey starts now.